Good afternoon, everyone. I promise you'll see less of me this afternoon, but we have now, excuse me, the first of our technical sessions exploring how CRVS systems in conflict, emergencies, and heavy migration situations contribute to protecting women and children. We have a fantastic panel, and I will leave the moderator to speak to the panel, but I will introduce the moderator. Rachel Snow, many of you already saw her this morning, heard her this morning. And I would like to introduce Rachel, who's sitting there on the left side from your end. Rachel Snow is the chief of the Population and Development Branch at UNFPA Technical Division in New York. Rachel is a respected researcher whose career spans more than 2 decades and who has directed research in Asia and Africa. She trained generations as a professor of University of Heidelberg in Germany, and in 2003 she joined the tenured faculty at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and the Michigan Center for Population Studies. I could go on for a long time, but I'm sure you'd rather hear Rachel and the distinguished panelists. So please, Rachel, take it on.
Okay, thank you so much, Montasa. I think we're all gathered back and we have all our panelists. Welcome to everyone. Let me say this is a specific focus on situations of conflict and humanitarian crisis. And during the introduction this morning, I think we heard a number of questions posed for all of us to reflect on. And one of those was, imagine you are someone who has been indeed displaced from your home, records are gone, lost, the government is in disarray, and you're in another country now, and you are without any legal identity papers, with a family, with et cetera, et cetera. So that's the question that this panel is really going to talk about. What are the realities, what are the challenges, and what are, we hope, some of the emerging solutions for being able to provide identity systems for people in very displaced and difficult circumstances. We have, as was mentioned, a great panel. I'm just going to briefly introduce them. You have an insert, I think. And first, let me immediately on my left is, please, Elène Bérubé. Yes, okay, who is with us from UNHCR and who's going to talk to us about gender discrimination, civil registration, and statelessness, the risk of leaving people very far behind. And she'll be our first presenter. And then we have from the Philippines, Rosalinda Apura, who's the regional director of the Philippine Statistics Authority, who's going to talk about CRVS in a very specific circumstance. And she's going to draw on a use case, a case study in the Philippines. And third, we have Martin Clutterbuck, who's with us from the Norwegian Refugee Council of the Middle East region, who's been doing some really interesting work in terms of trying to deal with registration for Syrian refugees in Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. So again, a very focused and extremely timely case study. And last, in terms of opening presentations, we have Allison Petrozziello, who is with us as a gender and migration specialist, a researcher who's talking about birth registration for migrant women. And last but not least, although not to make an opening presentation, we have Marwan Khawaja here with us from UNESCWA. And again, he's the Chief Demographic and Social Statistics lead here from ESCWA, a region with a lot of humanitarian challenges. And so he will also be giving comment. But to begin, please join me in welcoming Elène Bérubé. And the podium is yours. And if you would like, and there's a clicker. Okay. Yeah, for your slides. And someone at the back is going to be holding up signs which say 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute. So just see the...
Over there.
There's a lady at the back raising her hand. Okay. So just note she's going to be the timekeeper. And it's important, we have left about 10 minutes for each of the presentations, and we'll take questions collectively in the discussion. So...
Perfect.
Elène, over to you.
So am I speaking into this mic or this mic that's way up here, or both? No? This one? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you. I am a senior legal officer with UNHCR Canada here in Ottawa, and I'm replacing today my colleague Melanie Khanna with our statelessness unit at our headquarters, who unfortunately would have loved to be here, but is not here today, could not be here today. So I'm going to be doing my best to fill in for her, and if there's any questions or discussions that you'd like to continue that I'm not able to respond to today, I'll be happy to refer you to my colleagues in the statelessness unit, who I know would be very pleased to continue the conversation. So as Rachel said, my presentation will focus on the impact of gender discrimination in CRVS in terms of creating and exacerbating problems of statelessness, including in complex humanitarian situations. So UNHCR is the UN agency that's mandated to work on the problem of statelessness. And just to note, statelessness remains a relatively obscure issue as compared to the refugee issue, which is the other big population of concern for us. But it is a serious problem affecting millions of people. So what is a stateless person? It's a person who's not considered as a national by any state, and as such do not have the rights associated with citizenship. And oftentimes they don't even have the rights associated with legal residency in the country that they ordinarily reside or elsewhere. So they may not be able to access basic services and enjoy basic human rights. For example, they may not be able to go to school, to access healthcare services, to open a bank account, to work, and even to marry. We see this even in Canada, where we deal with cases of statelessness, not to the extent that you see it in other countries, but we often see that people who are stateless are the people who are the furthest left behind in our society. There are 3.9 million known stateless persons in 78 countries around the world, but UNHCR believes that the true number is really quite a bit higher. So there are 78 countries that report as to their numbers of stateless persons, but many states are not reporting clearly, and a number of countries, including Canada, don't actually even have a statelessness determination process in order to properly identify the number of stateless persons within their territory. So to try to raise awareness of this important problem and to galvanize the international community to resolve it, in 2014, UNHCR launched a pretty ambitious, I would say, 10-year campaign to end statelessness, which is known as the I Belong campaign. And the goal of this campaign is to bring an end to statelessness within 10 years by resolving existing situations and preventing the emergence of new cases of statelessness. The campaign is accompanied by a global action plan to end statelessness, which encompasses 10 key action points. And I'll just highlight two of them, which is Action 3, which refers to the importance of ending gender discrimination in nationality laws, which is important both to preventing new cases of statelessness and also to resolving existing cases of statelessness. And Action 7, which refers to the need to ensure universal birth registration so as to prevent statelessness associated with the lack of birth registration. While gender discrimination in nationality laws is widely understood as a cause of statelessness, gender discrimination in CRVS laws and practices as a potential cause of statelessness has to date actually received a quite little amount of attention. And this is important because there are a number of countries around the world where nationality laws do not discriminate, but where the CRVS laws and practices do include gender discrimination. So there's a few examples on the screen of gender-related restrictions to registering births. A few examples would be where only fathers are allowed to register births, where only the births of male nationals can be registered, the requirement for the father to be present if a child is born out of wedlock, and also there are examples of some birth status or family status discrimination, such as the requirement to present a marriage certificate to register a birth. So just to note here again, of course, that nationality is obtained in different ways in a country, usually based on parentage or country of birth or both, and that birth certificates really remain a key piece of information required to assert a child's right to nationality and to prevent statelessness. Lack of birth registration does not necessarily make people stateless, but it can leave people at increased risk of statelessness because they lack proof to their entitlement to nationality. Again, on the next slide, oops, sorry, realize I'm skipping, yeah, okay. So on the next slide, there are some specific country examples, but in the interest of time, I'll probably just skip over that and move right to discuss in the context of humanitarian situations. So UNHCR has observed repeatedly that in humanitarian emergencies, the risk of statelessness resulting from lack of birth registration increases. There are a number of reasons for this. First, registering a birth may become a low priority for parents in humanitarian situations. Civil registries may not be functional, or it may be impossible for people to access them. Authorities may refuse to register the births of refugees, which is something else that we observe. And then, of course, in situations of conflict and displacement, people often have to leave without their proof of identity, which can also make it difficult for parents to register their children and to have the parentage properly recorded on the birth certificate if there is one. We also see in many humanitarian situations a high incidence of sexual and gender-based violence and of children born out of wedlock. And in situations where there are gender family status restrictions to registration, the risk of non-registration and statelessness subsequently increases. And I believe that some of my co-presenters will be going into some more specific examples of some of these challenges in their presentations. So this next slide just really flags the key SDGs, which I think that everyone is quite familiar with, and which were probably discussed quite a bit in a high-level panel this morning, which I unfortunately was not able to be a part of. But just to flag the UN legal identity agenda here as a key initiative that involves cooperation across the UN family, and that there's lots of information available online about this initiative, which I believe was also discussed this morning, so I won't go into depth. But one key point that I did want to flag is with respect to the literature on discrimination in CRVS laws. And to date, the vast majority of literature on discrimination in civil registration and vital statistic laws focuses on the protection and empowerment of women and girls. And there's been very little academic attention given to date on the issue of statelessness caused by discriminatory CRVS laws. And so in the hopes of starting to fill some of this gap in the research, UNHCR and UNICEF are partnering to conduct research and produce a new publication on the topic under the auspices of the UNHCR-UNICEF Coalition on Every Child's Right to a Nationality. So we're hoping that there's going to be a publication by the end of this year, by the end of 2020. We'll see exactly if that happens by the end of the year, but something that's being worked on actively. And if anyone here is interested in contributing to this work or just in knowing more about it, as I said, my colleagues who I'm filling in for today would be more than happy to discuss with you. I'd also be happy to discuss a bit more at the break, but you could reach out to my colleagues, Melanie Khanna or Vijaya Ratnam at the... Sorry, I've fallen a few slides behind, I see, as I was chatting away. Yes, anyway, their contact information is here on the slides, and we're really looking for cooperation on this project. So any ideas or interest in participating would be great. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elena. Excellent. I think we're going to move directly to the next, and we'll take questions afterwards. So please, if I can welcome Rosalinda Apura from the Philippines, NSO, to join us at the podium. Is the clicker up there? Just make sure. Yeah, good. Okay.
A pleasant afternoon to everyone. Let me share with you the Philippine experiences in advancing the civil registration system in fragile settings. The outline of my presentation is shown on the screen, and that would include the introduction, the legal framework, the Philippine setting, strategies, recent developments, and the way forward. So to understand fully how CRVS works in the Philippines, let me share with you the role that the Philippine Statistics Authority play in CRVS, as well as its partner and stakeholders. The PSA plans, enforce policies, and coordinate government-wide programs governing the production of statistics and also civil registration. PSA has technical oversight for civil registration across the country and responsible for producing the vital statistics. The national statistician of the PSA is also the civil registrar general of the local civil registers of the country. And Ma'am Liza Bersales is the first NSCRG of the Philippine Statistics Authority when the 4 agencies were merged way back in 2013. PSA also serves as the central repository of more than 175 million documents, both for the births, deaths, and marriages in the country. The local civil registers, on the other hand, are responsible for the actual registration of vital events in all the 1,650 local government units in the country under the administrative supervision of the local chief executives. Then the Department of Health has supportive functions since most of the vital events interface with the health sector, and they are also responsible for coding the causes of death correctly and also training of the health workers. Other stakeholders plays a role in information dissemination and, of course, education and communication coordination, funding support, and collaboration for policy formulation. On screen is the flow of submission of civil registry documents from registration to storage. CRVS in the Philippines is supported by clear and established legal frameworks on civil registration, including the presence of the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, which also outlines the support of the government given to the women and children. And we also have the Magna Carta for Women, the Child and Youth Welfare Code, and of course, the Act defining violence against women and their children. And I would like also to mention the law allowing illegitimate children to use the surname of their father, providing the access to benefits. As you well know, the Philippines is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world due to its geographic location, which render it vulnerable to natural disasters. Approximately 20 tropical cyclones entered the Philippines, and it caused damage to properties, loss of lives, and also destruction of the civil registry documents. We also have a volcanic eruption, wherein Taal volcano had just experienced. We had the experience of Taal volcano recently, then flash floods due to heavy rain and soil erosion, as well as earthquakes, and part of the southern Philippines suffer also from that last year. We have here the typhoon-related deaths from 2011 to 2014. It was 2013 when Yolanda or Typhoon Haiyan hit the country, and it was one of the strongest typhoon in our modern age. Children and adolescents affected by the typhoon are at risk and not finishing school and are vulnerable for human trafficking and other related child protection issues. And some of the local civil registry offices also experience the destruction of their civil registry documents. So here are the CRV strategies during and after disaster or calamities that we have undertaken. Some of the strategies are as follows. We have the mass registration of deaths after Yolanda so that the victims could benefit money, around 10,000 pesos given to the victims and its family. We also have beneficiaries with vital documents in establishing their identity and entitlement to their rights, and also the privileges for the trace of affiliation, especially for field health or the health programs of the government. Then facilitate access to social and child protection program and services by reconstructing civil registry document at the national level. As I have mentioned earlier, we are the repository of around 175 million documents all over the country. Then we also coordinate with the local civil registry offices in the LGU and reconstituting lost records, provision of civil registry documents that you can use during mobile registration and mass registration. And also we coordinate with partner agencies for funding support, such as the IDEALS, the Plan Philippines, the UNFPA, UNHCR, and UNESCWA, and others. Then for the recovery and repair at the LCRO level and preservation through digitization on scanning and renaming. Then for the recent developments to strengthen CRVS, after the lessons that we have learned from Yolanda, we engage with the different agencies and as well as the global partners, and the government supplemented the legal framework for as part of its initiatives in improving the system. So one of this was a partnership with the World Bank. We have the Philippine Statistics Authority, also the DOH or the Department of Health, and we have Canada Department of Foreign Affairs, who made a case study on the Philippines in 2014, and also the support to the UNESCWA initiatives, official declaration of the President of the Philippines on the observance of the 2015 to 2024 CRVS decade. And we have supplemented the disaster risk management with another law. This one is the Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act, before, during, and after disaster. And Section 7 of that law states that PSA shall be responsible in the reconstruction of the civil registry documents. Then we have also the involvement of the different agencies, especially the support of partner agencies at the global level, especially this coming 2020 for the strategic planning, as well as the strong support of the government in monitoring the SDGs. Then for the way forward, PSA to enhance the linkage with the different agencies involved and increase public awareness and the importance of civil registration. So we'll have the continuous discussion of current civil registration issues with different technical groups, and to further enhance the relevance of the relevant policies and regulation, and PSA and the Department of Health to continue to work closely on capacity building of our medical practitioners and health workers for the improvement of CRVS in the country, specifically the filling up of the forms on deaths. As well as fast-track generation and publication of vital statistics in the country. In the case study, it was stated that it would take 3 years, and while we improved that, now we can generate it at 1.5 years. Then the continuous engagement with development partners, as mentioned earlier, and that would be the strategic planning with Bloomberg, and that would take place on March. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Rosalinda. And now we'll look forward to hearing from Martin Clutterbuck from the Norwegian Refugee Council Middle East region. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you. Yes, so within the Norwegian Refugee Council, we sort of specialise in legal aid programs. And within our legal aid programs, we also specialise in helping refugees obtain their civil documentation. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the situation in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq, particularly for women and for girls. So, we understand that war and conflict place enormous pressures on the systems for civil registration in conflict-affected countries. Government registries for issuance of documents are dysfunctional or destroyed. Records are destroyed. Large areas of the country sometimes are outside of the control of government, so the groups in control of other parts of the country issue their own documents, which are not accepted by the government. People die in wars, women, children, men. There's a lot of missing men often, and that results in a lot of widows, of course. And then there's issues in terms of issuance of documents and the change of family status for families. Sexual violence, many children of rape. So this really can push the documentation systems in a country to the breaking point. And of course, paradoxically, legal identity, proving your identity, becomes even more important sometimes in situations of conflict, because you need to move around. You need to have a document to pass the checkpoints. There's suspicions about who you are. Where's your husband? Where's your father? So it's critically important for people to have sort of documents. And often people resort to two types of documents: documents issued by the authorities in their area, and then documents issued by national authorities as well. But of course, women shoulder a disproportionate impact on account of their increased family responsibilities, carer responsibilities, sometimes in conflict. There's four main issues that we see as contributing factors to the problems that women face. The first one is the patriarchal laws. In many Middle Eastern countries, nationality is patrilineal. And additionally, men are often the head of the household for the purpose of issuance of important documents such as family books in Syria. Because a lot of husbands are missing in the conflict, the responsibilities fall on their wives to keep the family status updated and to keep the family books updated as well. And this results in extra hurdles in dealing with authorities sometimes, who are asking, well, where's your husband? And there's suspicions about whether a husband is involved in armed opposition groups, for example. Thirdly, there's additional family responsibilities in times of war. And of course, women, if they're in a situation where they're the primary carers then, need to have documents for movement, for accessing health services, for food rations, for humanitarian services as well. And finally, of course, there's increased protection risks for women, but also for girls. So I wanted to give three sort of illustrative examples, more from the field, a bit of a practitioner's perspective on some of the sort of cases we see on the ground. Maybe starting off with Iraq, IDPs in Iraq. So we've sort of estimated through research we've conducted that there's about 80,000 children plus who, Iraqi children, who are without birth certificates at the moment. And typically, the fathers are alleged to have been involved with ISIS. And so the authorities at this stage are sort of refusing to issue documents proving their identity, even though it's a requirement under Iraqi law, as it is in most countries, that you have a birth certificate. So for the women who are desperate to get birth certificates for their children, it presents all sorts of issues. Firstly, to get a birth certificate, you need to have proof of the father. If the father is missing, dead, disappeared, it presents a challenge. Secondly, you need to have a marriage certificate. If you've been married in a situation under non-government control, you've either been issued with a non-recognised marriage certificate, such as, in this case, an ISIS-issued marriage certificate, or you've married informally. This places a lot of pressure then on women to prove the existence of things. You can go to court, you need to call evidence, you need to have witnesses. It's a very tough process for women. If your husband's missing, you need to issue a notice in the papers putting everyone on notice that the husband is missing, which is stressful for women who are desperate not to draw attention to their situation. You need to file a police declaration about the missing status of your husband as well, and then wait for 2 years, and then the husband is presumed dead. That's the process. But in practice, most cases fall at the first stage, where the authorities even refuse to issue a security clearance for the husband, which is necessary for the birth, not in the law, but in the practice. There's a practice in Iraq particularly called the Tabriya process, which means you can, as a woman, make a statement about the actions of your husband as a way of, in court, as a way of sort of cleansing yourself, your family, and that is more likely to issue in a birth certificate for your child. This is an extremely difficult process for women, not one that we encourage people to engage in, but there's risks for engaging in this process, perhaps from the in-laws. There's risks for not engaging in the process. There's risks all around for women in this situation. Moving on to another situation, Syria. Syria, as you can imagine, has every single variation on difficult documentation processes. But one example also is women crossing the conflict lines to obtain documents. So I think for most Syrians, getting a government-issued document is very important, even if you're living in a non-government controlled area. So women typically will cross the lines into the government-controlled areas to try to register children, for example, or register marriages, which has personal risks in these situations, you can imagine. But also, you'll typically have questions as well. Where is your husband? Well, why hasn't he come across with you? Is he involved in the armed groups, etc.? So it's a difficult situation. The Syrian government has relaxed the rules for women, for example, who are not the heads of household for the purpose of the family book to update their family status, but it's still a really risky situation. A third situation is particularly facing girls, which is child marriage, which some of the other speakers have also alluded to earlier today. So I think we estimate, it's a cultural issue in Syria well before the conflict, but exacerbated by the conflict as well as a negative coping mechanism. So I think in Lebanon, for example, we've estimated about a quarter of girls are married between the ages of 15 and 17 as well, about 24%. So in Lebanon, in order to get a marriage certificate, it really depends on your religious denomination, which all have different rules. So in many cases, we have girls coming to us who are, very young, even sometimes under the age of 15, and they already have children, so they actually essentially just want a birth certificate for the child. But to get the birth certificate, they have to prove the marriage. So then it puts legal aid providers in an awkward situation of trying to register an underage marriage, which is lawful, in order to obtain a birth certificate for the child, which you can imagine causes all sorts of protection risks. Across the border in Jordan, it's a slightly different situation with a marriageable age of 18, but you can be married from 15 onwards if you have the consent of the chief judge of the Sharia court. But there are, of course, cases of girls who are having children under the age of 15, and for them there's no possibility of validating the marriage. It's an illegal marriage. So in those cases, sometimes girls have resorted to registering the child in someone else's name, obtaining false documents to suggest that the child is older than in fact the child is. It's a mess, you know, it's a messy situation. So there's some of the situations on the ground, all requiring a change in practice. So some of the 4 recommendations we would make would be the one that everyone's been talking about today, of course, is nationality rules which are gender equal equality. So the nationality deriving from both the father or the mother would make an enormous difference. The second one, similarly, would be birth registration of children, irrespective of the marital status of the parents. Again, they're tough issues, but they would make an enormous difference. The third one was more flexibility in procedures to issue civil documentation to civilians during conflict. I think in Syria at the moment it's 4 years to wait for if you've declared your husband missing. And the last one is just increased efforts to protect women and children from personal status-related violations and risks, including the risk of child marriage. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Having the concreteness of those issues was really helpful, I think, to all of us. Okay, and our next and last presentation will be from Allison Petrozziello, who's a gender and migration researcher. Allison.
Thank you. I've asked Martin to take a measure of gender equity here and move the podium so that I can actually see over it. So good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here and join in this important dialogue connecting not only the efforts to strengthen vital events registration and gender equality, but also to place those efforts within difficult contexts such as those of conflict, humanitarian disaster, and spontaneous migration. So as a gender migration specialist, my remarks will center the experiences of women in migration who face obstacles registering the birth of their children. And my research asks where in the world birth registration is being turned into what I'm calling a bordering practice, effectively blocking access to citizenship for minority and migrant populations. So this short intervention is based on an ongoing global inventory of exclusionary birth registration practices, where the process is entangled, has become entangled in migration enforcement, or there's been contestation or legal challenge. I also gathered examples of these practices while facilitating a workshop on birth registration at the World Conference on Statelessness and Inclusion in The Hague last June. So while both parents undoubtedly have a role in birth registration, I focus on migrant mothers because in practice, the mother's documentation and migration status often become determinant, as we've seen, as do social norms and legal frameworks around marriage, sexual and reproductive health, migration, and mobility. So in other words, the story starts earlier than the registration or not of the child. If we locate the pregnant migrant woman's body in time and in space, we can map out what is available to her and to her newborn child in terms of identity documentation, consular protection, which is something we haven't talked about yet, that I know of, migration status, and also healthcare services. So at any of these points, we find obstacles, which are compounded in contexts where questions of belonging are unsettled, or where there are structural forms of discrimination on the basis of gender, race, or ethnicity. So I will discuss several examples of obstacles to birth registration that are affecting migrant women's children in different places around the world. And then I'm going to flag a few of the best practices, quote unquote, for promoting universal birth registration, which may actually have unintended consequences for migrants. And I offer these findings as an input for dialogue on the hopefully productive tension between, on the one hand, the drive in which all of us are involved to strengthen CRVS systems to achieve legal identity for all, and on the other hand, gender-related obstacles to birth registration in a context of increasing securitization of migration. So, beginning with a few broad brushstrokes before diving into some examples, what are some of the gender inequalities involved in migrant women's access to documentation and their participation in labor migration? So, the World Bank has given us some statistics on the gender gaps in identity documentation coverage. And many of these are in migration source countries, as this graphic shows. And so unregistered people, to the dismay of many, do, in fact, continue to migrate. And if they're unable to get an ID while at home, it's even less likely, perhaps, that they'll be able to get one while abroad, especially if there are deficient consular services, or if they're seeking asylum. So in other words, gender inequalities mean that migrant women may be less likely to be documented in the first place, though it's hard to know that, and or participate or be eligible to participate in regular migration programs in the first place. So regarding their participation in those formal labor migration schemes, so these are more developed in some parts of the world than others, with states such as the Philippines having a long history of female labor migration. However, even in contexts where we have documented migrant women who are going abroad as women migrant workers, they too may face difficulties accessing birth registration for babies who are born so-called out of place. Certainly, Nicole Constable's research, she has a book called Born Out of Place, shows that women migrant workers from Philippines and Indonesia who are in Hong Kong have many difficulties accessing birth registration for their children. So obstacle number 2, I'm starting to track these kinds of practices. Some governments are bringing border enforcement to baby. We have states such as Israel that have stopped issuing birth certificates to babies born to foreigners. Last I knew, they were issuing handwritten scraps of paper in Hebrew and saying, go to your consulate. And that, unfortunately, does not lead to any form of documentation for their children. In the Dominican Republic, they have created a dual register system, a separate system for children born to foreign women or women who are simply undocumented. They are issued a different color paper when they give birth in hospital, a pink paper instead of a white birth notification, and are supposed to register in a foreigner's book and then go to their consulate to gain a birth certificate. Many people are of Haitian descent, and I have seen with my own eyes the rotting piles of duplicate birth notifications because the Haitian government does not, in fact, automatically register the births of children born abroad. Another case that I was paying attention to is in Texas. So even in countries with birthright citizenship, such as the US, some states have been changing the administrative rules required for migrants to get a birth certificate for their children. In this case, there was a lawsuit brought in 2013. They had changed the rules saying you have to have a passport with a valid visa. So again, introducing migration enforcement at the site of birth registration. And this was since overturned, but it seems that some states are trying to force the hand of the federal government to roll back birthright citizenship with the current administration. Who knows where this may end up. Obstacle 3 has to do with lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and rights for migrant women, which complicates access to birth registration, as we know. So it's been well documented by UN Women, where I used to work, and others, that migrant and refugee women face challenges in accessing reproductive and sexual health. And some countries have unfortunately taken the measure of giving healthcare personnel's responsibilities that go beyond an ethic of care and venture into the territory of nationality determination, which they should not, in fact, have. So this puts nurses and others in a difficult position and also makes healthcare a potential point of migration enforcement. So some migrants may avoid hospital birth altogether for fear of deportation. So the process for birth registration when born at home or with a midwife, especially if the birth attendant is not registered herself, is not straightforward in many places. And where they do give birth in hospital, there's also a problematic practice of health facilities withholding the birth notification to pressure parents to pay medical bills. And I've read reports of this happening in Morocco, but also here in Montreal. This is a completely illegal practice. Oh, I forgot to advance this slide. Here we have a South African, or an asylum seeker in South Africa who is suing the government because she was turned away from hospital care and ended up giving birth on a train platform. Imagine trying to document the existence of her child. Obstacle 4. So national origin presumptions often become a proxy for racial and ethnic discrimination, right? So all of these obstacles I've mentioned previously are compounded in contexts where these questions of belonging are unsettled or affected by these structural forms of discrimination. And so where parents' identity cannot be proven, Sometimes authorities make racialized assumptions regarding national origin, and this can be based on how someone looks, their accent, or their surname. The Open Society Justice Initiative has published an important report about citizenship securitization and nationality stripping in the United States, and how it disproportionately affects Yemeni Americans and Mexican Americans. So obstacle 5 has to do with ambiguity regarding the residence requirement. So to obtain birth registration, many countries have this requirement to prove residency. However, there's a lot of gray area and a lot of variation, sometimes even within the same countries, as to how residency is interpreted. So is it a legal migration category, such as permanent residency? Or does it refer to a residence permit, which might be extended to all regular migrants, temporary or not? Or does it refer to de facto residence, proving that one lives there, such as a rental contract or utility bill? And there, in this report by Bronwyn Manby, there are differences between Egypt and Morocco in terms of how this residency requirement is interpreted. Obstacle 6 is about deficient consular services. So accessibility of consular services is, for issue or renewal of documents, is key for migrant parents who may need to obtain a valid form of identity, ID, or a marriage certificate from their country of origin to regularize their status in country or to register the birth of their child. And when somebody, especially when somebody is seeking asylum, sometimes their case would be jeopardized if they were to approach their embassy. So there's also a demand side issue there. So it's a combination of costs, fear, lack of knowledge, and also deficient services, heavy procedural requirements that make it difficult for migrants to avail themselves of their consular protection. So I promised in the beginning that I would mention some of the good practices which I think that may have unintended consequences for migrants. First, we've seen good practices around linking birth registration to registration for social welfare entitlements, and that has been proven to increase demand for birth registration in many contexts. However, in a context of retrenchment of the welfare state, many states have taken measures to limit access to social benefits for migrants, especially those with temporary or no status. So this same linkage may have the opposite effect of preventing migrants, especially those with precarious status, from accessing registration. Secondly, the linkage of birth registration with maternal and child health care service provision. It seems like a no-brainer. Many children are born in hospital, and that's where the process begins. And it has increased rates of registration in many places. But what happens when, as I mentioned earlier, sexual and reproductive health is a key site of exclusion of migrant women? How does this affect their ability to register the birth of their children, for example, when born at home to a non-registered midwife, as we've seen in Montreal? And finally, this practice of decoupling birth registration from proof of citizenship. So this is how it works in a lot of places. It makes sense in many contexts to separate these. However, the creation of these separate interim or kind of ad hoc birth registration procedures for migrants or those whose nationality is undetermined may create a limbo state from which few ultimately escape. Is there any research on the empirical outcomes of these kinds of alternative registration practices? Is some documentation better than none? Perhaps. Yes, some argue that the birth notification is the most important piece, but the assumption that simply creating a procedure will leave open a pathway to citizenship is not enough. What's at stake? We all know this. Non-registration creates risk of statelessness. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that the efforts of everyone here today are so important as we collectively figure out how to strengthen vital events registration as an aspect of gender equality. However, amongst scholars studying migration and statelessness, some are asking whether the SDG target 16.9 should be read as an opportunity or a threat. As this presentation has shown, birth registration for migrants' children in contexts of migration and displacement is not a straightforward task. As new technologies and massive investment are being rolled out in the name of SDG 16.9, my research suggests that a dual movement may be afoot of authorities facilitating documentation for some and denying it to others the state is not willing to recognize. Let us not forget political will. If inclusion is the very first agreed upon principle for the World Bank and some 24 other actors working on identification, how can we guarantee that inclusion and non-discrimination are a central part of what we mean by strengthening CRVS? Perhaps most worrying to me, and I'll conclude now, thank you, is the gradual rolling back of the human right to a nationality and replacement with these alternative registers and ad hoc biometric ID documents. While these may provide some protection and access to services, they are not a replacement for the durable status of citizenship with all of the protections that affords. Let us continue protecting and using a human rights-based approach. So when we map this out across space, we continue to see racialized others being geopolitically, legally maneuvered out of existence, proof of birth denied. This effectively erases the existence of those inconvenient populations in the eyes of the host state. Promises of inclusion aside, the children of migrants and refugees are indeed at risk of being left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move right to Marwan, and I'm going to ask a question of each of you, and I ask, keep your responses if you can to 3 minutes or so, just because then I think we want to open time for the audience to ask questions. So Marwan, you've heard now 4 presentations. You handle Western Asia, a region which has such a high burden of humanitarian and crisis circumstances right now. Can you talk to us for a minute about what you see as some of the big challenges and a few of the very pragmatic lessons that emerged from your region?
Thank you, Rachel. I think Martin highlighted some of the important issues in terms of context in our region. And these constitute serious challenges. As you know, we have a large number of refugees and IDPs in the region as a result of the Arab Spring. 3 countries in the region are still facing ongoing wars. In our region also, personal status law is religion-based. It's not civil. And we have the patrilineal inheritance system that follows the male line, citizenship rights, and also given by the father or the husband. So in conflict-related areas, instead of highlighting what are the challenges in the region, I think it's more useful to take each country separately. There are specific issues affecting each country of the region, and they're unique. We started looking into these countries. Traditionally, so what happens in the data supply in general, not only CRVS, is we have, as Benoit mentioned, total disruption in the system. So the situation in Syria, Libya, Yemen, we lack data to begin with, and there is a total disruption of the system. So I wanted to highlight some of the issues affecting one country, Syria. And I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I do want to also follow what Martin suggested, is that in CRVS, the issue, we usually perceive CRVS as a neutral issue, and there is trust between citizens and the state institutions. What happens during wars is that this is broken. So self-registration becomes very politicized. And in a context like, for example, Syria, it becomes extremely so because of the nature of the conflict, that it is mainly perceived as sectarian conflict. So personal identity, or who you are, who is Syrian and who is not, becomes very charged issue. So we get, as a result of the conflict, although Syria has a long history of civil registration going back to 1855, when it was first introduced for military purposes, registering males. And then the conflict generates a lot of binaries. Like Martin mentioned, government-controlled areas and non-government controlled areas, pro-regime and against regime, and what have you. So registration, I think a lot of attention has been given to registration of refugees residing outside Syria. Little attention has been given actually to what's going on within Syria. I think the Norwegian Refugee Council has done a lot of important work in the region, including, as Martin mentioned, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Is that when we look at the system within Syria, so for the state-controlled areas, there are many challenges facing people, including IDPs. You have to register vital events in your country of region of residence, but you have large numbers of IDPs within Syria. These people cannot actually go back to their region of residence to register. We have the issue of missing men, largely. Some people estimate tens of thousands, and we have estimates about 200,000 missing men since the start of the conflict. Their families, especially women who are left behind, cannot really manage property, their livelihood, without proper documentation as to whether their husbands or brothers are alive or dead. There is also the issue of within the controlled area of forgery. Many cases we see that people register the death of their husbands, although they're still alive, but they are eligible for assistance. These things are apparently widespread with regard also to fabrication or falsification of ages of women because they wanted them to get married for the legal age of 17 in Syria. And then we had a large part of Syria, the majority of the land was actually controlled by ISIS and other militia groups. It turned out that they kept parallel systems for registration. So it really depends where Syria had an electronic registration system. It was disrupted for these areas, with the exception of two governorates, Haska and Afrin. But otherwise, when ISIS was defeated, they destroyed all the documentation they had. In some other militia groups, they actually followed the same state-controlled system for registering birth, death, marriages, etc. But the issue then becomes a very critical issue, whether the central government will recognize this registration or not. So there are a lot of these obstacles. One important issue I wanted to mention, and I'm going to just take half a minute, is that all the documentations in Syria, whatever documents, you need security clearance, state security clearance. And this is a major obstacle for people who are living outside non-government controlled areas to obtain it. Of course, I think there are huge opportunities for if there is negotiations for reconciliation talks, and then I think civil registration, which hasn't been talked much about, will be one of the important issues to consider because of voting rights, of who's going to go back to Syria or not, who's actually Syrian. Are these people who were in militia-controlled areas with their births, marriages, going to be recognized as Syrians or not? Many of them married to non-Syrians and what have you. But there is a huge opportunity for building a new system for all Syrians. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Marwan. Allison, I'm going to ask again, try to be quick, each of you, because we want to move to the audience. Allison, very quickly, you talked a lot about birth. You talked a little about marriage registration. Any comments with respect to marriage and its special implications for migrant women? Over.
Is this on? Yes. So we've already mentioned quite a bit about the importance of marriage registration, especially in contexts in the Middle East and North Africa, where this is a hard and fast requirement for birth registration. But I also perhaps can just add that it's also important in contexts of labor migration. And so I was reading about Indonesians who have gone abroad to work and may have children and feel stigmatized based on, you know, the circumstances in which their children were born. So it's really challenging for them to return home with a non-traditional family arrangement, such as being a single mother, a divorced parent, a mother of a child born to a man from another country who is not her husband, or indeed a child born of rape. That often leads to child statelessness. And so in the case of Indonesia, there have been some reports of women working abroad and choosing to leave their child stateless in the host country to avoid stigma because they're unable to obtain that marriage certificate as the first step to birth registration, or bringing the child born abroad home and then leaving it with relatives who may not be likely to pursue birth registration. In the Middle East, there are some places, I'm trying to remember if it was Egypt, that had some, yes, there was a law permitting other forms of proof of relationship, but in practice, as we know, it doesn't always uphold that law, and so officials were requiring the marriage certificate, even in cases of children born of rape. Only with legal assistance are people able to obtain that birth certificate for children born out of wedlock. And for a family member, a male family member can accompany the mother to register the child in their name in the case of a missing or deceased father, but only if the family member has all the required documents. And certainly, if there's no death certificate of the deceased father, it also complicates the situation. And then just on the flip side, I think we've already heard the connection with the prevention of child marriage, right? And so it's a protection issue as well, as our colleagues from UNFPA have brought out. But OHCHR has talked about this. The CEDAW committee and other treaty bodies have issued guidance to states requiring both births and marriages be registered to facilitate the monitoring of the age at which they marry, and also to support the enforcement of laws on the minimum age of marriage.
Thank you so much. Very nice. Okay, Martin, a slightly different question for you. You actually talked quite a little bit about registration of birth and marriage, but very little about death. So can you, again, sort of walk us through the scenario you're working in now? What are some of the challenges in terms of getting deaths registered for people who are displaced?
I mean, in terms of death certificates, it sounds a bit harsh perhaps, but you need to have a body. In situations of conflict, it's not always easy to prove that your family member is dead. We've been involved in exhumation sometimes to prove the death of someone, but often that's just not possible in situations where there's mass graves, etc. So in that case, you have to go through a court process of proving to the satisfaction of the judge that in fact the person is most likely deceased as compared to missing or in a detention centre or jail somewhere. So that's a particular issue, as well as all the pressure associated on the women, as we're talking about women today, through going through a court process, often very protracted, involving witnesses. You need to produce the witnesses from family members who are scared often of going to court or the authorities. In host countries, there's other issues. It's not so hard there to prove the death, but there's other bureaucratic issues. In Lebanon, for example, one of the issues there is you need to have a valid Syrian passport if you're a Syrian refugee, or a valid civil extract, which can only be obtained from Syria. So you might not have those. I think our evidence suggests about only 35% of Syrian refugee families still have their family book. So that's an obstacle. The second thing is the cost. For families who are poor, they might prioritise the cost of the burial over the cost of the registration, of course, as we all would. That's another issue. If the death has occurred at home, you need to get a medical practitioner to the home to issue the certificate. It's another cost. So there's some of the problems.
Thank you so much. Rosalinda, Philippines is sort of the first country out there in terms of the small island states seriously contending with fragile ecosystems and all that it implies. You've been through Yolanda. You've been through kind of lessons learned. Can you offer a few comments to take away for other countries that are dealing and anticipating again, these ecological crises and the implications. You mentioned a few things that Philippines has been doing to try to ease the process. So how do you contend with registration in the midst of these circumstances? One or two suggestions?
I think I have already mentioned the mass registration of deaths. And the other one is the conduct of mobile registration, especially if the structures, the civil registry offices are already destroyed, so you have to go from one place to another. But we had been doing mobile registration in the country, especially for far-flung areas, the communities that are usually inhabited by the cultural minorities or the indigenous peoples. And another one is the conduct of the mass weddings, wherein the child and the woman and the children are given the opportunity to access the privileges given to the husband, especially if they have already established filiation.
There'll be more questions about mass marriage in a minute, but we'll wait for the team. Okay, and last to Elena. Beijing is at 25 this year. Do you have any initiatives planned? What do you actually want to recommend and put on the platform Beijing at 25 from the work that you've been doing on statelessness and gender?
Well, I guess maybe I can speak a bit about some of the real opportunities that UNHCR is seeing and that we're working on, which is maybe a bit beyond the Beijing context. But obviously, there's a lot of increasing attention being paid to this issue, right? And greater coordination, I'd say, and concerted effort across UN agencies, but amongst stakeholders, including states. So that's all, very encouraging. I'd like to flag the I Belong campaign, UNHCR's campaign to end statelessness, which at the mid-year point in October 2019, we had a high-level segment on statelessness in which states and some other stakeholders, but largely states, made 360 concrete recommendations to end statelessness, including through some changes to CRVS laws. And I think that this really is an opportunity, and there's an opportunity now to be holding states accountable to the commitments that they made and following through on the commitments, and then to highlighting some of the best practices that states have adopted, working at a regional level to address some of the challenges. Those are kind of some of the exciting things we're seeing. Also, the UNHCR UNICEF coalition on every child's right to nationality, which I mentioned, where we're working with states and bringing states together to find solutions to the problem of childhood statelessness, which really, for us, is the best way to be preventing statelessness. And I also hope that the joint research that we're going to be doing with UNICEF that I mentioned at the end of my presentation on gender discrimination and CRVS laws will give us more comprehensive data and a better understanding of the gender-related obstacles to birth registration that put people at risk of statelessness, and thus will give us an opportunity for greater visibility and for more productive advocacy around the issue. All, of course, in line with the commitments that states have made in the SDGs and SDG 16.9 and 5. So.
Okay, thank you so much. We're all very optimistic. A big year ahead. The floor is open. We have about 15 minutes opportunity to hear questions, comments, please, and just visit the mic and please introduce yourself at the start. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm Fred from the Philippines. I would just like to comment on the presentation of Allison regarding migrant workers, especially the Filipinas. When accessing records on the supply side, the Philippines is very strong in providing the supply side because migrant workers in the Philippines could not go out of the country without that birth certificate or the marriage certificate. It is a requirement in the issuance of the passport. And also for vital events that occurred abroad, the Philippine consulate or the consul general becomes the civil registrar. All vital events will be reported at the Philippine Embassy, and that report of birth, marriage, or death will be forwarded in the Philippines for archiving and digitalization. So there is really no problem with accessing records for Filipino migrant workers. And also, on the question of racial, for Ms. Rosalinda, also one of the registration during calamities for birth is not really on the issue of mass registration of births, maybe of deaths, it could be an issue, but for births, because in the Philippines, almost, except for few pockets of the population, the registration of the birth is continuous. In all the health facilities, it is required as much as possible that children will be born in the health facilities. And we have very strong supply because we are preparing 4 copies of that document, and one of the copy goes to PSA for digitalization and integrated into our database. And we have a disaster recovery site for the database in which, in times of calamity, we could go back to the disaster recovery on top of the copies being lodged at the office of the civil registrar, the office of the health facility, and then the document owner. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few comments and questions, please. Yeah.
Quick comment, Catherine Harrington, Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights. Just a couple other related legal barriers related to this discussion and gender discrimination that I would be very happy to hear any comments from the panel. One, in terms of decoupling marriage certificates from access to birth registration. One of the things that we see in many countries is where there's no secular marriage and you have certain marriages that are deemed illegal. So we have cases where even where there is gender equality in the nationality law, we had an example from Egypt where a Muslim woman married a Christian man. They fled the country. They married in, I think it was Syria or Lebanon. So they got married, but then when they tried to access nationality documents for their child, even though an Egyptian woman has the legal right to confer nationality to her child, the consular authorities would not issue documentation of the child because the marriage was deemed illegal. Similarly, we know in some countries, I know in some countries that the panelists are working in where there are laws preventing sex outside of wedlock. So, and even in situations where the only route to a woman's ability to confer nationality on their children is in the rare circumstance where that child is born out of wedlock. However, she could face jail time or something worse if she moves forward and tries to access documentation. And then just the very last example that kind of brings together this, conflict and discriminatory nationality laws. We had a situation just in the past several months where a Malaysian woman married a Syrian man. They're living in Turkey. Malaysian women are unable to confer nationality on children born outside of the country. The Syrian father was afraid to go to the consulate to get documentation for the newborn child. The Malaysian mother had a dying father in Malaysia, wanted to go back home with her newborn to see her father, and could not get an emergency travel document for her child until there was a big uproar online. So just wanted to raise those other issues and welcome any thoughts on those points from the panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Highly complex. Okay, we'll take maybe 2 more. Do I see Ramesh and Niall? No. Okay, Ramesh, please.
Thanks so much. I had 2 quick questions, mainly targeted towards Rosalinda and Martin Clutterbuck. There was an interesting graph showing that there were about 3,000 or so deaths registered in the Philippines during a typhoon. I wanted to understand a little bit more about our knowledge about how many deaths are not registered in these kinds of, very difficult circumstances, and what kind of approaches you see having, what opportune approaches might shed some light on this. I think back in 2015, we saw in Syria, the UN humanitarian country team integrated questions on death registration completeness in the vulnerability assessment tool, survey tool there, and that's that's a key mechanism through which we know what the size and the profile of under registration in Syria. And then secondly, indirectly, whether you see opportunities or have had experience in looking at the delays in birth or death registration immediately following natural disasters. And then my second question was really to try to pick up on a number of points which Martin raised around flexible arrangements around civil registration in fragile and conflict settings. The Economic Community for the West African States, ECOWAS, has championed harmonization of civil registration laws and procedures across West Africa to sort of facilitate more streamlined birth and marriage and death registration in a very, very high, across a region or a sub-region which has a whole lot of mobility. The Norwegian Refugee Council has documented, for example, in Jordan that, Syrian refugees in Jordan, just to register a birth, need around 9 supporting documents, some of which are extremely difficult to obtain. And then further, we see local officials creating additional obstacles on top of those. And so I wanted to hear your experience and thoughts about how we facilitate that kind of flexibility, given that on the one hand we have the law, and on the other hand we have operational practice on the ground. And there's a lot of additional barriers and different adaptations which are implemented in times of fragility and conflict, which result in even more barriers. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm vertically challenged. Thanks for fantastic presentations. My name is Arjan Haan. I work at IDRC, and I'm not a civil registration vital statistics specialist. And I was going to ask the question, but somebody mentioned political will, and maybe this is for later in the conference, and this is not whether it's one or the other thing, but it does strike me when the specialists talk about problems with civil registration vital statistics for vulnerable groups, that any other sectoral expert would come up with the same things, but from a very different perspective. And my question, and I don't mean that in like the question is this important or not? Of course it's important, but my question is like, is civil registration the problem here, or is it the political will to include those population which is the problem? And I don't mean that in the way is it one or the other, because of course it's not, but there, for me there remains the issue that my partner who doesn't have a birth certificate because she was born in village in northern India, she has no problem in Canada, right, with a lack of registration, because Canada has a relatively inclusive system of public administration where the administration will deal with that problem because they're committed to including people. Now, again, that's not a point of like, should India have better birth registration? It would make life much easier. But my question really is, what do you specialists say in terms of, if you go to Beijing, you go to CSW, for example, right? Who do you address, right? Do you address the specialists, or do you advocate with the rest of the world to say we need to work on a political of inclusion and then civil registration as part of that? So, and I'm just saying that because you said political will. Otherwise, I wouldn't have raised it. No, thank you.
Very nice, and a great question, I think, for all of us here. All right, let's start with Marwan. Okay, is that all right?
I don't really have much to say except that to point out that we have anecdotal evidence, not really systematic, and a lot of perceptions. But in a situation in conflict, registration becomes like a tool for a weapon in a way against certain groups. And this is what we're hearing. So it's really it's not a technical issue. And it's sort of punishing the other in a way, so it becomes more difficult. And there is also, I work for the UN, maybe I shouldn't criticize too much, but there is a lot of corruption. Also, they call it economy of war. So instead of going through the regular procedure, you pay money, and then you buy your documents. I think probably the Norwegian Refugee Council is in the ground and documented these things, but there is that going on. And we hear it, I mean, we don't really have hard data about it, but in Syria, for example, or in Lebanon for that matter, you process these documents by paying money to local officials. So, I mean, the larger question is actually when the conflict is sectarian or it has religious issue, then it becomes like a tool you use against certain groups. This is the general perception, so I agree with you. I mean, they raised an important issue. It's not really CRVS per se, but it's something.
Thank you. Allison.
Thank you to the colleague from the Philippines, I think his name is Fred, for clarifying the availability of the services for civil registration at the consulates for women migrant workers. I think with Nicole Constable's research on what's happening is actually about the demand side and what happens when a woman migrant worker is mobilized in a labor migration scheme as a productive being who's not supposed to be reproductive while she's abroad working. And these migration schemes are circular or temporary in nature. So there are restrictions on her ability to stay. And there's no pathway to citizenship. And so on the demand side, we see messiness. We see migrant workers who have had children with other migrant workers from other countries and who are seeking to remain in Hong Kong in this particular case. And they're afraid of being forced to leave. They're afraid of the enforcement of the terms of their migration. And so these are people who are trying to navigate systems. And so when we're looking at the messiness of why people may or may not avail themselves of the existing services, we need to look at that. And I just wanted to address the point on flexible practices and what Martin brought up in his presentation, how when some desperate people may resort to having somebody else register the birth of their child in their own name as if they were their biological child. And so I wanted to flag that there has been some guidance issued by the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on Migrant Workers. They did two joint general comments, I believe in 2017, about human rights for children in the contexts of migration. And they say in there, and they recommend that procedures be created for rectifying birth registration for children or even youth who have come of age and discover that documents have been procured fraudulently by well-meaning parents, perhaps, we don't know, but on their behalf. And so kind of as thinking about it from a lens of child protection or youth, this child did not commit the fraud. Somebody else did on their behalf. And so what can be done, and there is guidance to try to rectify the registration for those cases. And just finally, on the question of political will, I agree that it's not one or the other, and with Marwan's comments about actually you can see the political will or lack thereof enacted in the act or not of civil registration. You know, when you look in the weeds, how it's actually implemented. And I've done ethnographic research in the Dominican Republic, where I observed firsthand what was happening with campaigns to do mass birth registration, where families were coming forth, both rural Dominicans and people of Haitian descent, presenting all their documents, very hopeful that finally they were going to be able to get birth certificates for their children. But when in fact all of those documents were handed over to civil registrars and decision makers, they started writing HH, hijo de Haitiano, or child of a Haitian, on the top. And civil rights or civil society organizations monitoring this have reported on it. And so they were simply not benefiting from the registration drives. And so I want to flag this, that, you know, there's money being made available, there are new technologies being made available, but if there isn't robust monitoring for these kinds of discriminatory practices, you know, there was a policy directive that the local officials were following not to issue registration for descendants of Haitian migrants. So God forbid all of our well-meaning efforts end up giving people who are following these discriminatory practices new tools to perpetuate existing discriminatory practices.
Okay, thank you. Martin. Yeah, I think you even had a very specific question to you, yeah, from Ramesh.
I mean, being an optimist, we'd like to think that there's a solution out there for everybody. It's just a question of how you get there, you know. There's easy cases and there's extremely hard cases. Seem impossible, but you never know. So I guess we would sort of group them into the cases where there's an individual solution. You have to be creative and you have to really force the case through the system, but there's a possibility with the use of some discretion or flexibility. Then there's cases where governments sometimes change the policies, but not the law, which are easier for governments to do sometimes. And then there's the changes of the law. So in relation to the changes of the practice, there's a couple of examples in the region of amnesties issued by Jordan, by Lebanon, by Syria as well, which have allowed people to register. You know, for example, in Syria at the moment, they've passed a directive where you can register with the embassies overseas or in Syria late within the next year or so. So whether you want to, if you're a refugee, approach the Syrian authorities outside of your country and register, that's a tough decision. That's a decision for people to make, but there's the possibility of that. And like I said, in Jordan and Lebanon, they've issued amnesties on informal marriages, for example, legalising informal marriages. In terms of changes of the law, it's much tougher. I mean, one example, again, using the Syria example, was in 2011, where the Syrian government actually allowed for the nationalisation of Syrian Kurds for the first time ever. So that's one example. And in Jordan, there's a practice, for example, if the mother is Jordanian and the father is another nationality, you're not able to get a Jordanian nationality, but you can get a Jordanian ID card, which is something. So it's perhaps an incremental step towards something in the future. Some examples in.
Thank you. More reason for optimism. Okay. Linda, we have a question to you very specifically, I think, from Ramesh, which was about delays in registration. Do you observe those, this phenomena of storm and then delay? I think he had.
Yeah, during calamities, we usually do the mass registration of deaths, and we have to identify the body. It is the relatives, the members of the family, who should identify it before we do the registration. And there are cases that these bodies are not identified. We have to also state the features and where we found the body, and also stamp the registry form that the body not identified. And there are some cases that because of the bodies are not identified, there would be delayed registration. And we also have another barrier, the cultural, because we have also Muslim communities in the Philippines that they have to bury the dead within 24 hours. And if the registration could not take place within 24 hours, that's why we have delayed registration of deaths.
Thank you so much. Last comment?
Maybe just very quickly with respect to the question of political will. And I mean, obviously, there are cultural, social, religious norms underpinning many of the discriminatory CRVS laws, as well as nationality laws. And I just wanted to maybe again make the draw to like where regional approaches can be really helpful in discussion between regions where there are similar kind of cultural underpinnings, et cetera. And just mention the Americas region really briefly, because we've paid a little bit of attention to the Middle East. And I would just say that the Americas is like the first region in the world that's hoping to be able to say it's eradicated statelessness. And if we want to look at another big crisis, humanitarian crisis in the world, the Venezuela crisis, we're seeing such huge numbers, pretty soon going to be up to 4 million displaced persons in the region. And we've been very encouraged by the response of a number of Latin American countries, neighboring Venezuela, to address issues that could really lead to high levels of of statelessness. And for example, Colombia, which has accepted recently not only to register all the births of Venezuelan children that are born in their country, but also to grant them citizenship. So again, I think there's a kind of the regional kind of, I don't know if I want to say pressure or acceptance can really, I think, play a role in the strategies. So.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're over time. So if I'm following 2:30, indeed, we're being pushed away here. So I just want to ask, please, let's have a very significant round of applause for all of our presenters. And I think we turn back to Montasser. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this fantastic panel. It really is sometimes worrying, sometimes concerning, sometimes depressing, but I think it really is a breath of fresh air to not worry so much about definitions and actually have a human-centered approach. What would the world look like if we put people at the center? And I think you give some really fantastic examples. Talking about people, we have, in addition to the 100 people we have in the room, we have also 71 persons online, 72. Now 72. So please know you're not alone. And again, it's a really great opportunity to be together.